Good evening and welcome to the Zoom Bible study on the Gospel according to Mark. Thank you for taking the time to watch tonight, and I hope that you will be blessed by it. The Gospel of Mark has become my favorite of the synoptic Gospels. Not only is it the shortest of the four Gospels and very fast-paced, but I love it because it's the earliest written Gospel that we have. And that gives us a look into how the earliest stories of Jesus were told. And through it, we get a glimpse into an early interpretation of what Jesus was all about. And as I've mentioned in all of these Bible studies, this particular study is not chapter by chapter or verse by verse. If we did that, even though the Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, it would still take us about a year to do so. Instead, I'm just taking a few chapters at a time and summarizing them and hitting the pivotal events and teachings in those particular sections. Now, so far in our study of the Gospel of Mark, we've put the gospel in its context. We've covered the highlights of Mark's overture and discussed how the themes in the overture preview how the rest of the gospel will be played out. We have spent time looking at how Jesus taught in parables, and we've also looked at Jesus's miracles in the Gospel of Mark and how those miracles supplement Jesus's stated mission of proclaiming that the kingdom of God has come near. Now, as we get into tonight's lesson, I want us to recall something from an earlier Bible study. Earlier in this series, we learned from Mark's overture that one of the primary themes of Mark is the way of Jesus, that we are to follow in the way of the Lord. The way also invokes the ideal of a journey. And in fact, the outline of the Gospel of Mark follows the geographical journey of Jesus. The first third of the Gospel is centered in the northern part of Israel in the area of Galilee. Then the middle third is about Jesus's journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And the last third is about Jesus in Jerusalem, which includes Holy Week, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Tonight, we get to the second part of Mark of Jesus's journey to Jerusalem. And yes, it follows a geographical outline, but it also becomes a metaphor to understanding what the way of Christ is. And I've prepared a brief and very simple outline of this section of the Gospel of Mark. And the thing that I want you to notice, first of all, and mainly what I want you to notice, is how the section of Mark, this journey to Jerusalem, is bookended by stories of the blind being healed, of the blind receiving their sight. That is purposeful. So we see the bookends of the blind receiving sight, and in the middle, Jesus keeps talking about suffering. I wonder if it is all connected. Well, I think you know the answer to that. Now, right before this section, in Mark chapter 8, verses 17 and 18, Jesus is frustrated with the disciples for spiritual blindness as to what the feeding of the 4,000 was really about. And Jesus says to them in his frustration, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have ears? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember?" And then immediately when we start this new section of the gospel, we see someone else given sight. So this whole section of Mark, bookended by stories of the blind being healed, is all about seeing. And the key question tonight is, will we see who Jesus is, and will we see what following Jesus on the way is all about? Then as soon as this first blind person is healed, to our surprise, for the very first time, a disciple of Jesus confesses that Jesus is the Christ. Finally, a disciple affirms that Jesus is the Messiah. The author of the Gospel of Mark, I know, proclaims that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, in Mark 1:1, but Peter's confession is the first that a disciple actually confesses. And remember that Mark presents the disciples as a pretty clueless bunch throughout the gospel. But in chapter 8, we finally get a breakthrough. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Now, there's always been diverse expectations in Judaism about the Messiah. But there was always general agreement that the Messiah would, one, be anointed by the Spirit of God, and two, the Messiah would bring forth God's reign upon the earth. And many also believed that the Messiah would do so by some type of military conquest before ushering in a time of peace in the world. After Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ that you see in front of you right now, Jesus then takes the opportunity to explain what type of Messiah he is. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Now, while Peter had gotten it right about who Jesus was, he still wasn't seeing that Jesus as Messiah meant suffering. It's not Peter's understanding of what a Messiah is to do. And this isn't what he signed up for when Jesus invited him to come and follow him, and that he would be made into a fishers of people. And after Jesus explains what a Messiah is to do, Jesus's response to Peter is pretty blunt. To be clear, Jesus isn't saying that Peter is Satan. It's not a proper name. Jesus uses the word that simply means the accuser or the adversary. Jesus isn't saying that Peter is evil incarnate. Instead, Jesus is calling Peter in that moment an adversary. In other words, Peter is acting like an adversary in the moment because he is standing between Jesus and God's plan. And that plan included overcoming evil and the principalities and the powers of this world through redemptive suffering. Then Jesus issues the call to what it means to follow him. And that's what this whole lesson's about. What does it mean to live in the way of Christ? We go to Mark 8:34. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." So what does this mean? What does it mean to deny yourself and take up the cross and to follow Christ? Very briefly, It means it's about a personal transformation. And I'll quote Marcus Borg's answer to this question, since it's far more concise than mine could ever be. Though taking up one's cross could refer to literal martyrdom, some of Jesus's followers were executed in the next several decades, and indeed for a few centuries. It had a metaphorical meaning as well. It referred to the spiritual and psychological transformation at the center of following Jesus, dying to an old identity and being born into a new one, dying to an old way of being and being born into a new way of being. I'm going to repeat what I've got underlined. At the center of following Jesus. What does it mean to follow Jesus? At the center, it means dying to an old identity and being born into a new one. Dying to an old way of being and being born into a new way of being. So what is meant by denying yourself? What does it mean to take up one's cross? And what it meant developed over time in the early Christian community. Remembering past lessons, we talked about how the Gospel of Mark, being the earliest gospel, gives us a foundational baseline to see how Christianity's understanding developed. Now, in Mark and Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Now, I think we can see how that could be understood by the early Christians as a call to martyrdom, a one-time call to martyrdom, because that's what a cross meant. It was execution. And sometimes it did mean that, as Borg pointed out. But as Christianity developed, the understanding of taking up one's cross changed. And we see this change in Luke's version of this, because in Luke's version, we have these words. "Then he said to them all, if any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." Luke added a word. The understanding and theology of early Christianity of what it means to take up one's cross has changed, it's developed. And so we see this daily, dying to oneself, dying to one's ego, and living in the way of cross, living in the way of redeeming love, living in the way of forgiveness, living in the way of suffering, living in the way of grace is something that is a process. It is something that we are to do each day. And the Apostle Paul understands this in a similar way. In Galatians chapter 2, at the end of verse 19 and 20, "I have been crucified with Christ." Now notice he's not talking about martyrdom here. "I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me." And I had to throw in Eugene Peterson's paraphrase from the Message Bible. "Indeed, I have been crucified with Christ. My ego is no longer central." Now, remembering how this entire section of Mark is bookended by the blind receiving their sight, the challenge for us tonight is, do we see what it means to follow Jesus to Jerusalem? What does it mean to follow in the way of Christ? And do we see what that means? It means that we deny ourselves, that we take up our cross daily and follow in the ways of Christ. It cannot be about ourselves. Jerusalem is a place of transformation. It is a place of resistance to Rome. It is a place of suffering and death. but it is also a place where the kingdom of God is revealed, and it is also a place of redemption and resurrection. So let us reflect on what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to follow him metaphorically to Jerusalem. And next week, we'll take on the last third of this amazing gospel, the gospel according to Mark.